Hello guys, this is me Sim Orahara, and in this video I want to talk about a topic that has been occupying my mind for a while, and it is important, so I want to discuss it with you. Our topic is about the origin of Schrift abilities that Yuhabas gave to the Sternritter. It's true that we know how the process of distributing this Schrift is done. However, Kobo didn't clearly explain the origin of these abilities. For example, the H ability that Yuhabas gave to Busby with the Schrift H. Where did Yuhabas get that ability of H in order to give it to Busby? Or the iron ability that was given to Kangdu and other abilities? So this is what I will discuss through my theory. This topic is hard to explain, but I will try as much as possible to simplify my point of view so that it reaches all. Of course, I'm not saying it's totally true, but with it I want to open a door for discussion, whether you agree with me or not. So in my opinion, the origin of Schrift that Yuhabas gave to others are divided into three parts. Meaning the source of any Schrift ability that Yuhabas gives to others comes from one of these parts that I'm about to mention. The first part meaning Yuhabas stole these abilities in the past and later gave them to others, and I will explain this later. Second part, Yuhabas doesn't give abilities, he just gives Schrift, meaning he gives the abilities a symbol or an identifying name like an ID card, because the recipient already possesses this ability, or Yuhabas develops the ability because the recipient already has certain qualifications related to that ability, and Yuhabas gives them a Schrift that fits their qualifications and makes them have that ability in a more powerful and versatile way. And the third and final part, Yuhabas himself already has these abilities. He has them from the beginning and he gives it to the recipient by engraving Schrift signifying ability inside their soul. And now guys, we have mentioned the three parts. Let's start talking about everyone in details. First part, what do we mean by storing abilities? What made me think about this is something mentioned in chapter 565, in which Kobo told us something about Yuhabas' abilities and how it works. Kobo said that Yuhabas had the ability to impart part of his soul with others, so that when Yuhabas was a child, whoever has certain illness and touches the baby Yuhabas, that illness will be gone. Meaning if someone has a fatal illness and touches the baby Yuhabas, he will be healed, and the same thing goes for someone who has a psychological illness. And Kobo gave us an example of a ball representing the soul of a person with a missing part, and that missing part is the illness he suffers from, whether it is physical or psychological or anything that makes his soul broken to lose a certain part. And here comes the ability of Yuhabas. With the ability to impart parts of his soul, he puts part of his soul instead of the missing part, and therefore it heals the soul of a person through healing its illness, whether it is physical or psychological. Until now everything is okay. But the next important point is that it's not over when that person's illness is gone. It's not like he will live his life comfortably. No, there are consequences of touching the baby Yuhabas. Because as Kobo said, all people who touched Yuhabas and got part of his soul died after a while. It could be after a few days or many years. Meaning the person who got part of Yuhabas' soul paid for the healing with his life. And when that person dies, what happens is the part Yuhabas had shared with that person for the first time is going to back to Yuhabas with all the knowledge of that person when he was alive. And focus guys at this point. Kobo added, and also that part returns with all the abilities that person acquired as well as talents that blossomed. All those things stored in that part of soul, and when the person dies, it returns to the child Yuhabas and he benefits from it. However, even with those deadly consequences, people around the baby Yuhabas kept touching him, which made him automatically share parts of his soul over and over and receive their knowledge, abilities, talents, until he was able to hear and see and grow up to be a young man. What interests me in all of this process is what Kobo mentioned, that the child Yuhabas has the ability to return part of his soul with other people's abilities. For example, if we assume that there is a person who has the ability to turn wood into iron, such as a wooden chair into iron chair or anything else, and that person one day got a deadly illness and one of his friends told him, hey look, there is a child who can heal people, just go where he lives and touch him, and it would heal you. So he went to Yuhabas and touched him, and by touching him, the deadly illness gone. And then the man lived for example 2 years, and then he died. So the part that Yuhabas shared with that man would return to him with all the abilities, knowledge and talent that person used to have, including turning wood into iron. So Yuhabas at that moment will find himself able to turn anything wooden into iron easily. And I hope by now you got my point by that example. So in the sense of this concept, which is to steal the abilities of others by distributing parts of his soul and returning it loaded with the abilities of others, can't be said that Yuhabas during his time as a young man would have acquired the countless abilities of others who touched him, especially since Schrift increased this possibility when he told Yuryu that both the Sternritter and the Shinigami who came into contact with the soul of Yuhabas in the last war, his soul parts will return from them with all what I mentioned earlier, abilities, knowledge and talents upon their death. That's why I suppose based on this information that Yuhabas during his life may have crossed people with specific abilities like Fullbring's, and it was confirmed that they have existed a long time ago, and Fullbring's abilities are similar to the Sternritter abilities in terms of diversity, and I will talk about it in the third part, which means Yuhabas may have stolen abilities from Fullbring's or Shinigamis by stealing their Zanpakuto's abilities, whether in a small fight or in the war of 1000 years ago. So the whole point is that Yuhabas stealing something is one of his greatest abilities, and we have seen it in different forms. For example, through the Auswehren, Yuhabas stole powers from Sternritter, who are useless, and distributed again to the rest of the Sternritter who considers them useful, and we saw that with the Shortstaffer. And also he can steal powers of his opponent, like what happened with Ichibi. So stealing the power is connected to Yuhabas in many ways, but in our topic I explained it, he can also steal abilities and reuse them and also give them to others. So it's not strange to say that the origin of some Sternritter abilities in the first place are the abilities of some Shinigami or Fullbring's that met Yuhabas in the past. Who knows, maybe the fear abilities of S-Not belongs to a Shinigami who met Yuhabas, and who knows, the iron ability of Kangdu belongs to a Fullbring. So this is for the first part, and now let's talk about the second part, which is Yuhabas giving Schrift to Sternritter, who already possesses these abilities, or they have something that made Yuhabas gives them Schrift. And as always, I rely on what mentioned in chapter 565. So in that chapter, it said, beside the first way of sharing his part of his soul by people touching him, Yuhabas eventually discovered a more powerful way than the old one, by directly engraving Schrift into their souls. And here I would like to explain an important point. This new way doesn't cancel the first one, and the proof is what I mentioned earlier. Schrift said that all Sternritter and Shinigami who were in contact with Yuhabas have part of his soul. And before we get to the core of this part, I have to say that the engraving of Schrift is also not clear, because when Schrift talked about it, Kubo drew Yuhabas as a young man, so it looks like at that time he started to engrave Schrift onto people's souls. And here comes a question: was Yuhabas engraving a limited Schrift that only healed what the person wanted, whether a physical or psychological illness? Because as we know, that the first Sternritter was granted a Schrift was Lilibaro, and the Sternritter have Schrift with abilities go beyond the concept of the first part. For example, S-Not, we saw in his flashback that he was in hospital when Yuhabas came to visit him, and through the first way, it's supposed that S-Not only touches Yuhabas, and this last will impart with him a part of his soul, and by that S-Not will be healed, and that's it. But it seems Yuhabas went beyond that by giving him a Schrift of the fear ability, so he can join him as a Sternritter. So I think the part of engraving Schrift itself exists in two ways. The first way, when Yuhabas was young and without any army, he engraves the Schrift onto souls of the person without ritual, so the person is healed and died after that. The second way was when Yuhabas grew up and he had an army. So at that point he began to grant the Schrift we know, through drinking his blood, as we saw, when Yuhabas granted Yuryu the Schrift A. Because we don't know exactly when Yuhabas start to grant Schrift to Sternritter. Does the first generation of Sternritter have the Schrift, or did it happen when Yuhabas regained his consciousness and used the Auswehren 9 years ago? And this is what I think most likely happened, because in Hirschfeld and Busby's flashback, when Busby joined the Sternritter, he was trying to fight Hirschfeld with just bow and arrows. If Yuhabas had granted him the Schrift, he would have fight with the heat ability. But he hadn't. Anyway, back to the subject of the second part. In certain cases, Yuhabas doesn't need to come up with the power of his own in order to grant it to the Sternritter, because they already possess it. An example is what Askin mentioned in chapter 656, when he said that Bernida and Gerard had powers before Yuhabas gave them any, and they are coincident that Yuhabas did not grant power to, but they were assigned their Schrift according to the powers they already possess. And there is another example, is about Shaz. And I talked about his story in a video of Kara versus Shaz. So Shaz is a Sternritter created by the imagination of Grimmy, but because of his ability, the viability, he transformed his imaginary body into a real body. And when Yuhabas heard about this, he didn't grant him a new ability, he just renamed the viability to a Sigma Schrift, and this was a category. And there is another category of Sternritter who have talent or potential power, since they were children, and Yuhabas improves it with his Schrift and gives it another dimension of power, like the twin Royd and Lloyd. They mimicked each other before birth, and after that they realized that they could mimic humans other than themselves. What I think is that Lloyd and Royd were mimicking like what we see in our reality, meaning imitating sound and movements. And when Yuhabas grant them a Schrift Y, the yourself, they became more powerful in mimicking other people, which means they mimic others based on the strength of the Schrift. And the last example is Yurio. Yuhabas mentioned that Yurio has some kind of power that exceeds Yuhabas' power, and there was no confirmation what was it, but of course it was the reason why he survived the Auswehren. I wouldn't say that it's the same as his Schrift ability, but it's like a potential power awakened by Yuhabas to become stronger with the Schrift A. In simple words, this abilities is not totally granted by Yuhabas, but the Sternritter possess it, like Bernida, Gerard and Shaz, and Yuhabas just grant them the Schrift, or Yuhabas improves this ability like the twin Royd and Lloyd and Yurio. Now we reach the final part, which is Yuhabas himself already has these abilities. He has them from the beginning, which means these abilities are not stolen from others like the first part, but he owns them from the beginning. Then how is that? I can simply say because he inherited it from Ryu. If he was his real son, the Almighty that Yuhabas had was already belongs to Ryu, and assuming that Yuhabas he is the son of Ryu, the reason why he had the Almighty because he inherited from his father. This may explain why both of them have same ability, and based on that, Yuhabas may also have inherited some other abilities from his father, according to what Ichibe mentioned in the novel. When he was talking about Ryu, he mentioned that Ryu was a Quincy, Shinigami and human, and he has many other abilities like that of Fullbring. Meaning Ryu has a lot of abilities like the Fullbrings have, and it was confirmed in the same novel that the origin of Fullbring's powers is the parts of Ryu, which means if Yuhabas inherited the Almighty, he may have also inherited other abilities. Consequently, he can give them to the Sternritter without stealing it, or even without using his Almighty power, so he just engraves the Schrift and gives the ability. So guys, as you can see, when you look deep in this topic of the abilities of the Sternritter, you find it very mysterious. So I try to showcase my opinion about this topic. What about you guys? What do you think? Do you have any theories? And do you agree with me or not? Tell me in the comments, and see you guys in my next video.